Well, welcome everybody. Sorry for the delay. We are here for the first of 2 Science Sunday Hangouts on air. This first one is going to focus on the question of whether there's life on other planets. And we've got a great group of guests here today to talk about that issue with us. We have, of course, Pamela Gay. Pamela, you want to say hi?
And good afternoon, everyone. Good morning, whatever your time zone is. I hope you enjoy what we're about to fill your heads with.
And Pamela, as you may know, is one of the extraordinary astronomers we have here on Google+. She was actually the very first woman recommended to the Google Science users list, and was very generous in trying to get other women on board there. So thanks very much to Pamela. We also have Doc Rock, as he's listed, who's Jonathan Stone. He's a biologist here at McMaster University.
Hello.
Jonathan. And we've also got Alyssa Cobb, who is a graduate student in physics and astronomy.
Hello,
and
everyone.
Her specialization is astrobiology. And we also have Ralph Pudritz, who is the director of the Origins Institute here at McMaster University. And he is also an astrobiologist himself in physics and astronomy.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the show.
And joining us soon, we hope, will be Chris McKay, who is an astrobiologist working out of the NASA Ames Research Institute in California. So we just want to start by saying, if people have questions, feel free to put them into the event list, and we'll be screening for those questions. And we're going to just start off by getting people's ideas about whether you believe there might be life on other planets, and if so, how do you think we could find it? Pamela, do you want to start off on that?
Sure. So I have to agree with Carl Sagan. When he was writing Contact, he said that it's an awful waste of space if there isn't other life out there. And I think the real question, though, is there other life that's had a chance to reach intelligence out there? Even within our own solar system, NASA is busy looking for habitability on Mars. We believe that Europa and Titan possibly could have some sort of life there as well. But the complex situation that's required to build complex intelligence might be more rare. The stability that's required, the lack of solar flares, the lack of constant bombardment by asteroids, the long-term stability of your plate tectonics. So many different habitability factors are required just to give life the chance to get there. But what's kind of awesome is every civilization that follows the path to technology that we followed going through the let's pollute our entire atmosphere phase is actually highly visible to technology we have today. It's possible as we start looking at more of these extrasolar worlds that are being found by Kepler and by ground-based telescopes all over the planet, as we start to follow up with them and look at their atmospheres, especially with the upcoming James Webb Space Telescope, we'll be able to see the signatures of life within their atmospheres, and perhaps even the signatures of life that is using their own world's version of petroleum in their atmospheres.
Interesting. Ralph, do you want to add anything to that?
Well, I'd just like to pick up with what Pam said. As an astrophysicist, I'm tremendously excited by the fact that we found over 800 other worlds, thousands of candidates from the Kepler mission. And of those, we've discovered a whole new class of planets, super-Earths, Earth-like things between 1 and 10 Earth masses. And the statistics are piling up as I speak. There's probably a very good chance that perhaps at least half the stars in the galaxy will host planetary planets or planetary systems. That's a bit optimistic at the moment, but the numbers are firming up. And surely, with the discovery of super-Earths and things like Earth-like planets now, we cannot be unique as an abode for life. It would be hard to imagine, even on our own galaxy, that the Earth would be the only place, just given the numbers And given the types of systems we're discovering, it's very exciting new days.
Very much so. Pamela's comment on Carl Sagan's quote, that's actually one of my big things in astrobiology. If there's nothing else out there, that's a terrible waste of space. And I can't believe that we're the only things in this entire universe. And following what Ralph mentioned concerning the number of habitable planets, I think the current estimate for the number of habitable planets in our own galaxy is something like 200 billion, which is extraordinary.
Right. And John?
I'm in agreement with everyone else on the panel that has spoken so far. And I'd also add that here on Earth, within the last 25 years, we've discovered that organisms can adapt to environments that before then were thought to be completely inhospitable to life. And so even within our own planet, we're still discovering life. And so there's every reason to suspect that on celestial bodies outside Earth that we could find life there as well.
So that brings us, I think, to one of the first questions from our viewers. Robert Woodman has asked whether Europa would be the next logical place to look for life. And if so, what would be the best way to go about doing that task?
It's unclear if it's the next best place to look. I just finished attending the Lunar and Planetary Sciences Conference down here in Houston. And what was amazing is all of the discussion of potentially still existing glaciers on Mars that are just buried under perhaps meters of debris. And we now know from the results of Lake Vostok in our own Antarctica that there is life unlike what we had experienced. Potentially, the results still need to be confirmed in our own subglacier lakes on our own planet. And so there's the potential that Mars, which is a world we're already covering in robots and we've already contaminated with our own bacteria, it might be the best place to keep looking for life either in the subterranean glaciers or to look for past evidence of life. Europa certainly is a challenge that we want to take on, but it's a pristine challenge. We haven't yet contaminated that little moon. And I think we have a lot to learn exploring someplace we've already contaminated before we go someplace and inadvertently kill off all life just because we don't sterilize our spacecraft well enough.
That actually brings back to another question we'll come to in a minute. So remind me on that, Pamela, if I don't get back to it. Anyone else on Europa, or you pretty much agree with?
I'd like to pick up on that, actually. The Europa is exciting. Europa briefly is thought to have a 100-kilometer deep ocean underneath the ice, which we do know it's an ice cover to this. And we do know that there are organisms, perhaps John can pick up on this, that like to live in ice. So in many ways, it's a great candidate beyond searching for life on Mars. The thing is, how would we access it? We don't know how thick the Europa ice lid is on that ocean. Could be a kilometer, it could be 15 kilometers. This great Vostok drilling experiment we just talked about, drilled through very painfully over many years, carefully drilled through perhaps a few kilometers. My own favorite beyond Mars would be Enceladus, which is an ice-covered, probably ocean-covered small moon around Saturn, in which we've got cryovolcanism. We've got volcanoes that are shooting out water and probably organics, whatever's in the ocean underneath the ice on Enceladus is being shot into space. Great thing to do would be just fly through that spray and sample what we see, looking for organics, etc.
John, do you think Europa is a place to go, or you want to go traveling through space?
I like them both. I have a personal interest in Europa because I study organisms that can adapt to cold environments. And so we do find life here on Earth in both poles, both polar regions, in the Arctic and the Antarctic. And as well, I think that we've learned over the last little while that we shouldn't be surprised to find life anywhere we go. Europa is particularly interesting because it falls outside the habitable zone within our own solar system, the region within which water would be present in liquid on a planet's surface. So it's a particularly interesting kind of counterexample to some principles that we apply in looking for life elsewhere in our solar system.
And just to be clear, while it's outside of the region where sunlight is responsible for creating liquid water, it's because of the constant gravitational tidal forces that it's experiencing from Jupiter that it does have liquid. It's essentially being squished like a stress ball over and over and over by these tidal forces. And if you either bounce a super ball too long or squish a stress ball too long, you'll actually feel it heat up. Well, when a giant planet does that to a little tiny moon, that effectively heats it up. This is the same reason that we see amazing volcanoes on Io. All of these worlds that are in various resonances around Jupiter, they are heated through a different mechanism in physics.
That's really interesting. I want to come back to Pam's point from before, because we actually had a question from Kyle Kuchme, who was asking about the prime directive, effectively, on Star Trek, which is we talk about finding life on other planets, whether it's on Europa or whether it's on Mars or whether it's somewhere else. But have people been thinking very much about the ethical implications of that? Even if it's just sort of disturbing the dirt on Mars that we're seeing some of these things. If there are microorganisms down there, have people been thinking about the ethics of introducing and contaminating those systems that are out there?
I think to start the answer to that question, I know that NASA is very concerned about planetary protection policies, as they phrase it, studies as to what you need to do to spacecraft to make sure that we're introducing as least as possible type of contamination of the planetary surfaces. We saw a good example of that actually in the Vostok Lake drilling experiment in Antarctica, where the drilling was halted for many years until it could be demonstrated scientifically that we would not be contaminating that pristine lake water that we are about to drill into in the Russian site. So even here on Earth, this has been taken very seriously in our search for exotic life here. And I believe that as we learn more about that here, this will just amplify our thinking, this very important thinking about what we need to do about exploring other planets.
John, you've actually done work in extreme environments. What sort of care do you take to make sure that you're not disturbing things there, and how would that apply out in space as well?
Yeah, the best approach is to take as sterile an approach as possible, using as clean an environmental apparatus as possible, disturbing the environment as little as possible. We've done work in the Arctic, and sampling up there, of course, some of our field sites have already disappeared as a consequence of global change. And so the best you can do is try to minimize the impact on the living systems that are present, and that's generally done by using sterile approaches. In space, of course, the issues are amplified by technical requirements, being able to control the apparatus in such a way so as to minimize the contamination of the environments that we're encountering.
Yeah, and one great example of how we've taken this into consideration is the Galileo spacecraft when it was orbiting Jupiter. They recognized it was reaching its end of life, and rather than keeping it going till the last possible moment to keep getting data, they instead purposely crashed it into Jupiter when they knew that they still had full control of its engines. And that way they were able to make sure there was no chance it contaminated one of the potentially habitable moons.
And that suggests that it might be a useful thing, as I think John was mentioning, to practice in a sense here on Earth. And so one question is, what environments can we investigate here on Earth to learn more about potential sites for extraterrestrial exploration beyond Earth?
The obvious places to look for are in the polar regions if we're looking for cryophiles, organisms that can withstand extremes of cold, say minus 80 degrees for extended periods of time. Deserts also pose many obstacles to living organisms, both in terms of the desiccation, the dryness of the desert, but also in terms of the radiation impact, extended periods of radiation. And so organisms have to develop means not only for protecting themselves against the radiation, but in some cases actually being able to counteract the effects of radiation by fixing their DNA. So they actually incur mutations, but then can fix those mutations before they have a detrimental effect.
And I'd like to add, in addition to the extremophiles that John mentioned, there are also the halophiles, creatures that like lots of salt. So looking at places like Shark Bay in Western Australia are good examples of looking for extreme life that lives in extreme environments, just the lots of salt.
Yeah, that's excellent. Extremophiles is the general term that's applied to such organisms. Organisms, the name itself refers to the fact that we find organisms that seem to love extreme environments. And in some cases, they're organisms that we find in regular environments right here off campus in Cootes Paradise that we bring into the laboratory, and they're able to withstand these extremes because they come from a lineage of organisms that has adapted to extreme conditions perhaps in their distant past and have carried this on to the modern day.
And beyond just looking at, go ahead, Ralph.
To amplify what Alyssa and John just said, if you look deep in the subsurface of the Earth, you find big bacteria, organisms going down to a few kilometers beneath the surface. There's a very interesting new work being done on the extent of the biosphere into the Earth's surface crust. In the early Earth, when you had life was formed here, apparently. The best evidence is that it was formed within a few 100 million years or so of a very heavy bombardment of the Earth's surface. So conditions for the earliest organisms would have been extreme in many ways. They may have had to hide out deep in the subsurface in order to develop a proper biology. And the recent surveys, there's been a lot of interest now focusing on deep subsurface regions of the Earth. Perhaps that would be needed on Mars as well.
And beyond simply the biological extremes, you also have to worry about the technological extremes. And what I love is the fact that this is something people are moving forward with. In a lot of the areas of South Central America, there are these amazing sinkholes with underground lakes that span miles and miles and miles. And there are teams that are working to figure out how to build the technology to automatically map these underground lakes and river systems. And that's the same technology that we'll need, admittedly much more robust, but it's the same technology we'll need as we go forward to start exploring underground oceans on other worlds.
And that raises the question of whether, once we figure out how to do it here on Earth and we do go out into space and try to find life there, would we expect to be finding life of the same kind here and there? Or, for example, my son made me ask a question. He made me promise to ask this question. He's 11. He wants to know if it's possible to have a whole planet of fish people somewhere out there. Or would life look like us? Would it look like just microorganisms? What would life look like out there?
I think the expectation is that we'll find life, if we find life, if we were to find life out there, that the signatures of life would be similar to what we find here. At least that's the principle that most scientists have been operating on from the early days of astrobiology. And and that kind of guides how we search for life elsewhere in the universe. Fish people is an entirely, I'm an invertebrate evolutionary biologist, and I've learned that nothing can surprise anybody. You find organisms that resemble, they can adapt to different environments, take on all sorts of phenotypes, and but that's not what we're looking for initially, at least.
I'd like to add that to some extent the search for extraterrestrial life is very much limited to our own technology, and what we know how to search for right now is life that is similar to life on Earth. So there might be fish people, but because we don't know what they look like or what environments they need to live in, it's hard for us to look for them on other planets. So everything we're looking for right now is very much similar to life as we know it.
Our technological limitations right now are the life forms that we can detect need to alter their atmospheres in ways that can't occur in equilibrium naturally. So simply the presence of oxygen is a sign that there's some sort of life there. Other chemicals out of chemical equilibrium can also raise questions, but it's not as certain. And then, of course, there's are they leaking radio waves? That's only probably a brief window in civilization. Think about how little power is getting used by all of our increasing devices. And as our iPads and Nexus 7s release less and less energy into our environment, it gets harder and harder to detect us far away.
So that raises the question that we've had asked over Google Plus about the search for life using things like looking for radio waves and so on, and SETI and the WOW signals. Are those going to be a useful way to find life out there, or do you think that there might be other approaches that would make more sense?
I think it's a very important question. there's probably likely, by several types of argument, that microbes are very simple organisms. You know, there's the variety of chemical gradients, little environments that life can creep into, the bacteria and archaea, etc., can make use of to drive their own metabolisms. It doesn't need to be photosynthesis, could be a wide variety of things. Probably made it, early life had a wide variety of different environments you could choose. It seems in biology, and maybe John could think about this a little bit as I say this, that the more advanced life, this multicellular life and stuff like us, only appeared 500 million years ago. You know, maybe up to 3 billion years ago on this planet, it was just largely single-celled organisms. That sort of gives you the indication that maybe it's very hard to make complex things, you know, especially fish people and things like this. So we're thinking that maybe microbes might be easier to find, and all of our searches are directed at that. But extraterrestrial intelligence, all bets are off, really. There's brilliant work that has been done in the SETI program. Jill Tarter is the head of that, and the surveys for radio waves, of course, through space. We're all excited by that, but a much, much harder thing to achieve, we think, than perhaps evidence for the simplest things.
And the search for intelligence also brings up the Fermi paradox of, if there is sufficiently advanced life out there, why haven't they contacted us yet? Why aren't they everywhere we look? If you don't know about the Fermi paradox, I'd encourage you to look it up. It's really an interesting statistical argument for life either not being as curious as humans, or perhaps being much more difficult to reach the stage of being able to explore among the stars.
And so one other question that comes up is, given the possibility that there could be life out there, maybe it's just microbes and not fish people, how many planets are out there already that we know might be good candidates for us? We talked about Europa, we talked about Mars. People talk about you know, the Drake equation all of the time. Whether it's intelligent life or just some sort of lower level of life, we're only looking for things right now that kind of fit our definition of life as opposed to some other form of life. But what are the chances out there, and where should we be looking?
Could I just clarify, was this fish person supposed to be intelligent, or were they supposed to be unintelligent?
I think the fish person was supposed to be intelligent and eat human sushi or something. I'm not really sure.
But probably the other members of the panel could probably better answer where we could look, exoplanets and things of that nature.
So if anyone has heard of the Kepler Space Telescope, that is one of the most exciting machines we have in space right now for astrobiologists and for physicists and astronomers and all sorts. The sole purpose of the Kepler Space Telescope is to look for what we call exoplanets, and these are planets that orbit stars not our sun. So it's distant planets that orbit stars somewhere else in our galaxy. And Kepler.
So I think there have been, just to pick up what Melissa said, there's been now, I think 150,000 stars have been surveyed, and if you do the statistics, just to give you just a rough number, I'm going to speak it as astronomer for a moment. There's 100 billion stars in our galaxy. The most common star in our galaxy is something that's about 1/10 the mass of our own sun. Okay, that's the typical star. It's a feeble kind of radiation from there. So there's 70% of all stars are like that. Okay, so we're still talking tens of billions of stars. If you look at habitable zones around those stars, and we've seen now planets around these so-called M stars, if you ask yourself the question, which we do in our astrobiology classes here, what fraction of those might be habitable? In what region could you find water on a planet that would be liquid? The answer would probably be you would end up with something like a few 100 million of those M stars, just the M stars, that could have habitable zones. A few 100 million. I think that says a lot.
It does. And actually, it's related, I think, to a question that Sylvain Wispy has asked over Google+, which is noting that life on Earth tends to produce gases in large quantities, like methane and oxygen and CO2. And his question is really, if we detect those gases on other planets or moons, would that be taken as an indicator of extraterrestrial life? Is that one of the markers that you're looking for?
It depends on the ratios of all the things in the atmosphere. So oxygen in general doesn't like to be all by itself. It likes to form up into other molecules. So finding oxygen is one of the things that's considered an indicator that there's probably life. But methane's more complicated. Methane does get destroyed by sunlight, but it can exist, as we see in Titan's atmosphere, if it's being generated deep inside of a planet through tectonic processes and perhaps other processes as well. We're still trying to figure it out. CO2 just likes to exist. Mars has a rich CO2 atmosphere at some points, especially what gets me is its poles will actually melt as the seasons change, and so you can end up with essentially fog machines running as a pole sublimates into gas, and that gas enters the atmosphere and then refreezes on the other pole. So we have to understand a lot of complicated chemistry and atmospherics to figure out, is the chemistry that we're observing allowed, or does it require life because it's out of equilibrium? Oxygen is the one thing that we know we can look for now, and folks at various astrobiology institutes are working to define what are the other out of equilibrium scenarios to look for.
And I think that's actually related to a question. I think that's actually related to a question we've gotten from Nathaniel Smith, in a sense, because we're looking for something that we know, because this is how we've evolved. But what Nathaniel wants to know is whether evolution has to necessarily follow one path in a specific environment, or could we start in one place and end up with something completely different from how, even if the starting environment was the same as it is on Earth, would we end up with exactly the same thing, or might it go in a different direction?
Now, there's two interesting points with that. That's an excellent question. There's two interesting points about it. The first one is that even here on Earth, conditions now aren't how they always have been. And so when we're searching for life on another planet, it does depend on what state the planet is in its own evolution, in its own development. Then the main part of the question, though, has to do with a scenario that the great evolutionary biologist Stephen Jay Gould offered many times in his publications. If you were to replay the tape of life, would you get the same results every time? And he was a big fan of contingency, the idea that evolution is a historical science. Mutation is the basis of the evolutionary process, natural selection, so well documented and described by Darwin. And the idea is that it's not a predictable science in the same way that physics is. We can make predictions ahead of time for the future in evolutionary biology. It is a predictive science in terms of population genetics. We can predict which virus will be most prevalent next year, and we can try to inoculate people according to that prediction. But looking back in time, the macroscopic view of evolution is inherently fraught with contingency. And so I think most biologists would agree that you wouldn't expect exactly the same organic profile, the biodiversity that we do see now, if we could do a great science experiment and replay the life here on Earth.
I also follow up on this really interesting question. The Earth's atmosphere has, of course, from the earliest days, more than 3.5 billion years ago, been completely transformed by the effects of living things. Biological warfare was played by the organisms that could produce oxygen and was able to kill off other organisms that could not live in an oxygen-rich atmosphere, as an example. So there's an interesting bifurcation and possible evolutionary histories right there must have taken place on the Earth. If you want to go to an exotic atmosphere that's maybe full of hydrocarbons, check out Titan, which is a very, very dense atmosphere, lots of methane, very exciting place to try to address your question.
If I may add, the reason that we can breathe oxygen, many eukaryotes can metabolize using oxygen, is a product of an evolutionary trick. It's thought that all of the mitochondria in our cells, for example, derive from what once were free-living bacteria. And so this endosymbiotic event, this idea that there's organisms or the remnants of organisms living inside our cells, our own cells, allowed us to ultimately to exist in an environment that otherwise would have, as Ralph rightly pointed out, would have been poisonous to ourselves. So, and that's the type of event that I don't think one can predict as well as one could predict, say, the motion of a planet around its sun.
So if we're out there looking for life, and we're expecting to be mostly microscopic, we're looking for things that are kind of along the lines of what we're expecting. So we've got these rovers up on Mars, and there was a recent report that suggested that Mars was once teeming with life. What is that information based on, and what does the exploration that's going on Mars tell us about life, whether it's microscopic or fish people?
Well, I don't think that most of the planetary scientists who are studying Mars are ready to say that it was teeming with life, but they're definitely willing to say it was teeming with water. And the evidence that we have is the more we study Mars, the more we see riverbeds, we see clear evidence of craters that formed such that there was mud in the ejecta as a function of melting subsurface glaciers. And all of this water, to many people, points towards past habitability. There was a brief window in the past on Mars where its entire environment wasn't all that different from Earth's.
And one question we got from Andrew Planet, who is aptly named, is wondering, when we're going off and doing all these explorations in space, whether it's on Mars or somewhere else, we're bringing information back to us, hopefully down the road. We try not to contaminate their planet. What can we do to keep from contaminating our own when we're bringing back information and samples from other places?
Well, here's a mind-blowing idea for you, that in fact we may all either be Martians or Earthlings. That long ago, say life started on Mars first, the heavy bombardment of all our planets at those early stages may have really broken off bits, chipped off bits of Mars that had living things in them, and the debris fell here on the Earth. So this idea of contamination may have been, it's possible that that's how life spread through more than one or two planets in our own solar system. Just kind of an intriguing sidebar to your question.
Well,
sorry, go on.
What's kind of awesome is we do have samples from Mars already, even though we haven't had them brought back from a spacecraft. These are Martian meteorites that are regularly collected quite often in Antarctica because as things melt, they reveal meteorites. What we're missing is what's called ground truth, the ability to know, I'm looking at this image from space, I'm picking up a rock from that place, and I know this atmospheric signature, this imaging signature corresponds to this rock. That's why we want to go and rove with rovers that can then send back samples in the future, is to get that ground truth.
Right, so that's a related question that we've gotten, which is if we do find things that look like life, say in Mars or somewhere else, how do we know that it's really coming from there and it's not just contamination from us or from somewhere else?
That's an excellent question. In some cases, we can't, I don't think. There's experiments that have been performed with bona fide animals, metazoa, organisms that I'm interested in, that have been exposed to the conditions of space. They've been exposed to the vacuum, the low temperature, the severe ionizing radiation, and they managed to survive. And these are multicellular organisms. So they at least can survive exposure to space conditions. Whether they could survive transport is a second question, and whether they could survive the impact event that would produce a meteorite in the first place and the re-entry factors that they'd have to encounter. These are all separate questions, but there's reasons to expect that it's possible. Organisms are able to withstand extremes, and so in that case, if we were to find two identical organisms on Earth and on, say, Mars, it would be difficult to say which came first. We might be able to date some things if we found fossils, for example, but I think just looking at two organisms or the genomes of two organisms, I think it would be, if they were similar in many ways, it would be virtually impossible to distinguish between the two.
Right, go on, Ralph.
Yeah, there's a very, very interesting and important point here, is that people are hoping that you will be able to see evidence for so-called second genesis of life if we find things on Mars. This question, would it be very different or not? How would you tell? One of the ideas has been that if you looked, as an example, at the amino acid patterns, say you scoop up a piece of Mars, which the MSO rover is able to do. Chris McKay is involved in such experiments, actually. And you analyze the amino acids there. On Earth, all our genetic code, our life uses 20 basic amino acids out of the typically hundreds that could be out there. And the question might be, if organisms were Meteorites, we do know, carry amino acids. They've brought them to the Earth. If you look at the surface of Mars, first of all, you get rid of the meteoritic pattern, what meteorites bring. This is a topic of Alyssa's own master's degree research with me, as an example. You subtract that out, and the question is, what might you be left? Yeah, if organisms like to use and amplify other types of amino acids, perhaps you could check the pattern of amino acids, say, on typical materials here in the Earth versus, say, on Mars. The other question you could do would be to look at the bases, the 4 bases that make up DNA. That might be, maybe a different base was chosen by a different type of life. We have no idea how to constrain that now other than to look.
Or if I may add to that, even the handedness of the molecules themselves would be an interesting scenario that you could have. Here on Earth, we have amino acids that are all left-handed. So that's a good news to 11% of the population, I'm sure. But on Mars, oh yeah, Allison, on Mars though, it would be an interesting scenario if we were to find life there and it had all right-handed amino acids. It would be a very interesting, otherwise identical, just a mirror image. So that type of question is, I think, still wide open. Why we have left-handedness here on Earth? There's ideas and theories, but I think the question is still largely unsolved. And so, it's at least in principle, we could expect to find such organisms elsewhere.
You know, it's been said to us that left-handed people are either brain damaged or extremely intelligent. It's hard to tell. Maybe I wonder, Alyssa, if you might be able to address the question back on the meteorite issue. In 1996, there was news about a meteorite that life was found, a Martian meteorite. How do we get those meteorites in the first place, and what evidence how can you use the study of meteorites to tell you whether there might be life there or not, whether it's contaminated or really from an extraterrestrial or origin?
Without commenting specifically on the meteorite from 1966, as Ralph alluded to just a moment ago, my research focuses on modeling the synthesis of amino acids inside the meteorites. So before a meteorite hits the Earth, it's just floating around in some meteoritic parent body in space, and there's a specific series of chemical reactions that go on inside of that meteoritic parent body. Given some set of initial reactants and the right temperature and some water, you're going to create organic material. So then, you have organic material, you have amino acids, and you have polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, and methane and ammonia, and some other very important organics. And when a piece of that parent body breaks off and it makes it through the Earth's atmosphere, we then scoop it up off of our ground, and that's a meteorite. And specifically concerning that's not contamination, I don't know if John wants to comment on that. There are some chemical analyses that you can do to verify that something is not just terrestrial contamination, that it is actually extraterrestrial in origin.
And how many of these meteorites end up striking the Earth every day, every week, every month? I mean, how common are these occurrences that we find these kinds of things? How hard is it to get samples?
Oh, if you want to go to Antarctica, you see them. There's a yearly expedition to Antarctica, which you can collect, let's say, I wouldn't say a ton, but you can collect many, many hundreds of grams of material just by sending an expedition out across Antarctica. You see these black rocks on the snow laying there. You pick them up and take them back to a lab, so the samples are fairly easy to acquire. If you go to a place like that, I would just want to say one thing about Canadian samples. There's a famous Tagish Lake in northern Alberta where a meteorite fell, was seen by a knowledgeable collector who collected it properly. He put with sterile gloves and putting it in a cold box that he had. This is an invaluable specimen because the degree of contamination is as low as we know of. And that's a very, very important thing, going back to Alyssa and John's comments about this, is how you collect this material matters a lot. And there's abundant material now. Every day, by the way, we are showered with meteoritic dust that falls into the upper atmosphere. The U-2 flights in the 1960s went high up and could collect this stuff directly. So, and at the time the Earth formed out of things like very large planetesimals, etc. So bombardment has been continuous.
So, and with regards to the 1996 announcement that there was a team that thought they had found life in a Martian meteor. That result has never been confirmed. And what they thought they had found was nanobacteria. Now the caveat is that the way they were looking for it was they were looking at the texture in the, I believe it was an electron scanning microscope of image of the rock, and you have to gold plate the meteorite in order to be able to get this type of imagery. And there were many people that pointed out that if you gold plated the sample, you'd get the exact same result as if there were nanobacteria. So this is a very controversial result that remains unconfirmed many years later.
Recently had that giant meteorite crash in Russia, and we've had a question of, is that the kind of meteorite that's going to tell us about life on other planets? Or I've also heard people say it's quite a boring meteorite, and so maybe it's not going to tell us anything. What do you guys think of that one?
That was what's called an ordinary chondrite.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just a main belt glob of rock.
There's a particular kind of meteorite that we're interested in. In all of meteorites, there's only something like 4% of meteorites that are the type I was talking about, that have organic material in them. And that's a particular kind of meteorite called a carbonaceous chondrite. But it only represents about 4% of total meteorite falls. And unfortunately, the one in Russia was not the type that carries this organic material in it.
Oh, that's interesting. It's interesting because I think people are under the impression that you can sort of, meteorites are meteorites, that they don't really realize that there's lots of different kinds of meteorites. And part of that might be because of the media and the movies that we see, the E.T. kind of movies. And my son is going to apparently make a Fish People movie down the road. And what is it about the media that gives us this misconception about what astrobiology is and what we expect to find about extraterrestrial life? Because we're hearing from you guys, maybe it's really just microbes and little things like that are out there, and not ET kind of creatures or fish people. So how is the media influencing our perception of astrobiology, and how does that compare to what really goes on when you guys are doing it?
I think I applaud your son, because this is one perspective, and I'll get to another perspective in a second, is that the TVs and movies, I think, have been sorely unimaginative in their aliens that they've conjured up. And in my course, I challenge students to try to create their own extremophile organisms. And there the boundaries get pushed a little bit, and I'm impressed usually. But I think if you asked practicing astrobiologists, where's the greatest likelihood, I think most astrobiologists, 99.9%, would say microbes are, that's the guiding principle. That's what we're really looking for when we say we're looking for life. Or the signatures of life is probably more precisely what we're looking for. We're looking for evidence on the basis of what we see here on Earth from microbes, what we might expect to find on other bodies as microbial signatures, if you like.
Since the issue of extraterrestrial intelligence has been brought up, one of my own favorite readings of that is Carl Sagan's book, Contact, and the movie that came out of that. Movie isn't quite Carl Sagan's book, but that idea that when we contact extraterrestrial planet intelligence, if that ever happens, think of the rate of evolution of our own culture here on Earth. Realize that it's only taken us a century to go from introducing electricity in cities to now being able to probe the outer boundaries of the visible cosmos by astronomy. By tinkering with how life may have originated here on the Earth, etc. Give civilizations a spread of a few million years. The relation between us and such an advanced civilization is phenomenal. I mean, what would you say to an ant? Type of a thing. So that opens such a wide horizon for discussion. It's very difficult to grapple with, but I do feel Sagan did a great job in starting to think this through.
Yeah, and Justin Starr actually on Google Plus asked a question about whether it's fair to describe evolution of intelligent life as hard. And basically his view is that evolution is a sort of an arms race. It goes in whatever direction is going to allow life to thrive more successfully. So could it just be luck in some sense that we've on this planet evolved in a way to end up in our current state?
Yeah, the specter of contingency arises again, and that is certainly a very defensible perspective that he has taken in his question. And so it might be the case that intelligent life here on Earth, if we can describe ourselves as that, that indeed it is incidental and accidental. There's no prescription that says that this is how it had to be, and that we would be here thinking about it even today if there's no laws predicting that.
If I could jump back into this, because it's such a fascinating question. You know, I think we, members of this panel that you see here, and again, 99.9% of scientists perhaps, you know, the microbe question is easier. The founders of astrobiology in the 20th century, these great figures, Oparin, the Soviet scientist, and Haldane, the British Oxford scientist, thought that life began once on our planet, began through laws of physics and chemistry. You could understand those well enough, maybe we could get some understanding of the origin of life. I think when you, and that's been our guiding idea actually, but if you think about very advanced life that we're discussing now, we just don't know what extra principles we need to add on to that to understand something, the development of something very complex. There, I think we are still very much in the dark.
I'm unmuting. Chris McKay has just joined us. So welcome, Chris.
Thanks.
So you've gotten here sort of just in time, because we're starting to talk about, we're almost wrapping up, but we're starting to talk about missions that are out there and what we could expect in terms of finding life on other planets. And I wonder if you can bring us up to date a little bit about what's happening in the Mars missions.
Right, thanks. Yeah, I'll do that. I actually heard most of the panel discussion so far. For reasons which I don't understand, I was able to hear you guys, but I wasn't able to join up. And I want to second what Ralph said about Enceladus being a good place to scoop up samples without risking contamination. But as to Mars, indeed, there's some interesting results coming back. We've managed to find what is clearly an ancient lake bed deposit, material that was put down in water that was pretty benign in terms of its pH and salinity and mineral content. We haven't yet confirmed that there's a biologically available source of nitrogen in those sediments, but that may be coming. And we are still searching, of course, for organics. Now, even if we find organic, it's not necessarily the case that those organics are biological, but just finding organics would be an important boost in our understanding of Mars. Now, we don't have to have organics for an environment to be habitable, but if an environment was inhabited, you would expect organics to be left behind. So searching for organics is a key part of this mission. And we have on the Curiosity rover, we have an instrument that can do that with much greater capability than the previous search, which was really Viking many years ago. And we think we now finally understand at least one possible explanation for why Viking failed to detect any organics, and that was due to the presence of perchlorates in the soil, and that's been confirmed already by Curiosity.
So there's a question about whether there are any more missions that are coming up to try to search out life out there, and one question from Nathaniel Smith is asking us whether there might be life on asteroids, and are there any missions that might be coming up that are going to be exploring those asteroids? It was actually a timely question because I was just watching C-SPAN this morning, and they were going over the recent U.S. government discussion about the dangers of asteroids and other extra Earth objects, both to, you know, in terms of hitting us, but also in terms of damaging the economy and all of the space industry. So, are there any other? What are the plans in terms of looking at asteroids?
Well, there are missions being planned. OSIRIS-REx is a mission that's being planned. The focus of these missions is not to search for life on these asteroids, but to understand them. And I would predict, as you're indicating, that as a result of these recent events, there's going to be interest in going to asteroids, not for point of view of searching for life, but the point of view of understanding their dynamics and understanding the possibilities for deflecting them if one is on their way to Earth.
Everyone else agree, or?
Mining asteroids is also probably going to be in our more distant future, but they're definitely more of a resource than a biological question.
Now, if I was going to prioritize biological targets, I would say Mars, Enceladus, Europa, and then a long shot Titan with its bizarre surface liquid.
And how likely is it we're going to make those sorts of missions in the future?
Well, Mars is hogging all the attention. It's got a big mission now, and the next big mission that NASA's planning is a rover in 2020 also to Mars. So I think there may be some pushback from the outer solar system people, and I'll help that push to get some missions out to the outer solar system.
Yeah.
My personal favorite is Enceladus.
And the budget that was released yesterday actually reinstated a significant portion of the Planetary Science Division's budget. And there is talk about continuing outer solar system missions, scoping and figuring out what's necessary to get the outer solar system Clipper, I can't remember its precise name, back on the books as a future mission. Now, the real thing to remember is we are not so much technology limited anymore as we are financially limited. So if you want to see these explorations taking place, make sure your congressmen know that you want to see these explorations taking place.
Well, and it's also interesting that increasingly it's depending not just on what's happening in one country, but collaborations across countries. So
yes.
Telling our congressmen won't help because we're in Canada, we don't have congressmen, but we can tell our MPs instead. But it seems more and more clear that to learn anything about what's happening up beyond our planet, we have to start collaborating more. And even just hearing the discussion here, it's clear that the field of astrobiology is not just astronomy, and it's not just biology, and it's not just geology or chemistry or any of those sorts of things. It's really the connection of all of these. So we've actually just started a graduate program in astrobiology here, and Alyssa's one of our very first members of that program. And is this something that you see coming down the road, that we'll start seeing more collaboration across countries and across disciplines to start solving some of these big questions?
I think it already is, very much so, Alison, that the international community gets together on these large missions, say to Mars. Canada, as an example, has a small presence on one of these missions, and most countries are involved in this. Science is a truly international activity, and the rising costs of very ambitious experiments just enforce that all the way down the line. And it's very exciting. Scientists are trained, educated, and think as members of an international community. And you're right that astrobiology, as our own newly founded graduate program here, following the lead of a couple of eminent programs in the United States, emphasize that. Even your training, where our emphasis is that you need to train deeply in some field, say physics or biology or biochemistry, whatever you have, but that your education takes you out of that field, exposes you to the broader picture that we're talking about here, enabling you to pick very well interesting problems that you'll probably be collaborating on in order to solve.
And I'll just add to what Ralph said. That's true not just in astrobiology, but in many areas of science, global climate change, particle physics, big astronomy, observatories, etc.
It's true that we need to have people collaborating across countries and across disciplines. Is that what you mean?
That's right. That's right.
Yeah, we like to use the word transdisciplinary here at the Institute, borrowed from Sidney Brenner, the forcing people out of their comfort zone and to work with people in other fields really is the hallmark. If you're sending astronauts to Mars, if that's a planned mission, each individual on that flight will have to have multiple talents. You can't have just one doctor, and so I think transdisciplinary is future education.
And it's interesting, and it's good that it's happening here and in other places around the world, and I think there's hope then for the future. We're going to be wrapping up in a few minutes, but I want to maybe finish by getting your ideas about whether it's going to be possible in our lifetimes, recognizing that we may not have all the same lifetimes, but roughly speaking, the same lifetimes. Are we going to actually find extraterrestrial life in our lifetimes? That's a question we're getting, and I'd like to know what you guys think about that.
Could I stick my neck out as an astronomer? Let me start that, just answering your question. That I feel that within a decade we will have, we've already identified habitable, somewhat Earth-like planets. And if those are detected to have oxygen, as Pamela was talking about in the beginning of discussion, oxygen is so far out of equilibrium. If you see oxygen in abundance, it has to be continuously made by some process. And that process we have no idea other than light. So I would say, as a smoking gun, with the advent of the next space flights and our 30-meter telescopes in the next decade, that we will have the tools to really find the smoking gun of oxygen in outer atmosphere. So I'm going to put a qualified yes for exoplanets.
And I'll just +1 what he said.
I will +2, plus a huge spoonful of I hope so. I think that's boils down to.
Now I'll fall right in line, and I would be shocked if within the next decade there wasn't some pronouncement of a smoking gun for life somewhere, a signature, some piece of data or evidence that for life somewhere else in either in our solar system or beyond.
And Chris, maybe I can ask you, since you're so close to the Mars mission, do you think that what we're learning there might actually, that might be the smoking gun that what we're going to get from this mission, or are we going to have to look further?
It's hard to predict. Every time we think we know what we're going to find on Mars, we find something different. So I've become reluctant to predict what we're going to find there. But I think Mars is a good chance, and also Enceladus. The plume of Enceladus is organic material ready to be investigated. The interesting thing about finding evidence of life in our own solar system is we have a chance not just of determining that it's alive, but have a chance of getting a sample of it and analyzing it, which would be very interesting, particularly if it represents a second genesis of life.
Yeah, and Stephen Lucas has asked, we've talked about oxygen as a marker in a number of cases, and he's asking whether oxygen might be able to exist underground, but not above the surface. Might it be that you've got to sort of look underground to be able to get it? If we're just sampling things on the surface, are we going to miss out on some interesting information?
Well, on Mars, it's certainly possible that the subsurface is more habitable. But if oxygen is being produced, it's going to bubble up to the surface, I would think. So if there's oxygen production, we would see it at the surface. But the basic idea that life may be underground is a very important one. And I think on Mars, that's the direction we have to go.
Okay, well, I'd like to thank everyone for taking part today. Thanks to John and Alyssa and Ralph, and thanks to Pamela and Chris. And remind people that you're welcome to add questions and discussion onto the thing, and we'll see if we can get some more answers to you once we go offline. And I also remind you that we've got another Science Sunday Hangout coming up at 6 p.m. Where Boudini and Scott Lewis are going to be talking to a nano expert, and they're going to be actually giving you some live demonstrations from an electron microscope. So stay tuned for that, and thanks to everyone for coming today.
Thank you guys.